There is a part of the bayou, far from the worn paths of more hospitable wetlands, where the dense cypress trees stand like silent sentinels. Their bleached trunks twist skyward, forming strange shapes in the murk, and the moss that drapes over every bowing branch holds secrets older than any diary. Local folk stories warn travelers of this place, urging them to keep away at dusk, but not everyone listens. They speak of a lonely cabin perched on a soggy strip of land, half sunken, as though the bog itself is attempting to devour it whole. Roots slither beneath its foundations, while grim water laps at its front steps. Those who pass by before the moon rises claim to see a pale silhouette at the window, but by the light of the stars, something far more menacing emerges. No one can quite agree precisely how old the legend is, only that it has haunted the region longer than living memory. Some say the building was once the humble home of a reclusive healer, a woman who knew every medicinal herb that grew in the swamp and cured feverish children free of charge. Others whisper the occupant was a hopeless wanderer, lured there by mournful voices in the night. Still others believe it was constructed for a nefarious purpose, a hidden lair for conjuring unspeakable spells. Whatever its beginnings, all the locals agree on one thing: the presence that stalks those flooded halls belongs to a swamp witch, bound to the land by a curse that refuses to let her spirit rest. It is she who whistles softly across the water on moonless nights, beckoning the curious closer, then punishing them with a curse that follows them even after they flee. I first heard the stories from my grandmother. Wise and superstitious, she'd lived in a house on stilts near the edges of that swamp her whole life. When I was just a child, she'd hush me at sundown and whisper, "Don't you wander past the dead cypress grove after dark, or she might catch your scent." Back then, I believed these stories were told only to scare me into staying indoors. It wasn't until years later, after she passed and left me her weather-beaten property, that I learned the truth. With little but a dusty inheritance to my name, I moved into her old house, intending to fix it up. I imagined spending quiet evenings reading on a rocking chair, maybe studying the swamp's wildlife. Yet I could not escape the dark legends that surrounded her land. The nights were calm at first, unsettling, but calm. Summer heat pressed in from all sides, and the air was thick enough to taste. Bullfrogs croaked incessantly. Even mosquitoes buzzed in a heavy cloud, forcing me to keep every door and window screened. A single kerosene lamp cast warped shadows across the wooden walls of the stilt house, and I tried to tell myself I was content. However, once the full moon drew close, the uneasy stillness in the swamp shifted. The hush after sundown grew deeper, as though every living creature realized something else was stirring, and they must remain silent to avoid drawing its attention. On my grandfather's old fishing boat, I spent my afternoons exploring shallower waters. Each day took me closer to the area I'd promised myself to avoid, lured by battered curiosity. Locals I encountered occasionally told me to be wary of the dead-end channels. When I asked about the rumored cabin, they lowered their eyes, muttered something about unclean spirits, and waved me off in warning. On a particularly sweltering afternoon, I found a narrow canal choked with reeds and rotting driftwood. Beyond it lay a stretch of unnerving quiet. I could see through the parted reeds, water tinted a sickly green, a scatter of gnarled trees losing leaves in large, soggy clumps, and, in the distance, the slanted silhouette of a wooden structure looming where no dwelling should be. My heart thrummed with both dread and fascination. I rode closer until I caught the faint echo of a soft voice, even though there appeared to be no one but me and the alligators about. That voice was more sensation than sound, but it seemed to hum across my consciousness, lightly tugging at me. In the day's heat, I shook it off as a hallucination born of sweat and exhaustion. Still, I made a quick retreat, carefully steering the boat away. Yet the notion of that cabin lingered in my mind long after I returned home. At dusk, while I labored to cook in my grandmother's old cast-iron pot, I swore I saw something moving between the cypress trees in the distance, a tall figure, perhaps a woman, trailing a tattered shawl. When I flung open the window to look, no one was there, just the rippling reflection of moonlight on stagnant water. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of exhaustion and the gloom. As the days passed, the feeling that something was watching me became stronger. Occasionally, I glimpsed fleeting shapes at the perimeter of the swamp, half hidden behind mossy trunks. The nights brought strange dreams. I would see that cabin perched in the bog, glowing with a flickering candlelight, and a figure beckoning me forward. I'd wake drenched in sweat, convinced the figure's eyes were still on me from the shadows. My grandmother's vague warnings loomed in my head like a storm cloud. I needed to see the place up close, if only to quiet my curiosity. Perhaps, I told myself, the fear would dissolve once the reality of the structure was laid bare. So one muggy afternoon, I loaded up the boat with a lantern, some rope, and a pack of supplies. The journey through the swamp seemed to take longer than before, as if the land itself was trying to confuse me. Unfamiliar channels appeared, and my attempts to navigate by memory grew frustratingly complicated. At last, the path narrowed enough to force me onward by foot. I tethered the boat to an old stump and plunged in, calf-deep in the water, feeling submerged roots snag at my boots with spidery fingers. The undergrowth was thick, and a nauseating smell of decay hung in the air. I pushed aside scratchy branches, fighting to keep my balance. At length, I saw the cabin rising up through strands of drooping moss. It looked caught in a losing battle with the swamp. The walls were sagging, as though years of dampness had warped the timbers into a permanent stoop. The front door hung ajar, swinging gently in the breeze, betraying the faintest hint of movement within. I felt a tremor pass through me when I realized there were footprints in the muck leading inside. Clear, fresh footprints, far larger than my own. Something or someone had been here recently, and that notion made me check over my shoulder. No one was in sight, yet I could feel the watchful gaze from somewhere. Perhaps from behind that door or from the back window. Summoning courage, I stepped inside. The floor was uneven, slick with algae in spots. Gaps in the walls let in finger-like beams of hazy sunlight. A single table sat rotting in the center of what might have once been a kitchen. Moldering baskets and jars, crawling with small insects, were scattered across its surface. Along the far wall, an old hearth sat cold, choked with soot and spiderwebs. Yet, for all its neglect, the air felt charged with a presence that made my scalp prickle. I reached for my lantern, struck a match to light it, when something scuttled across the ceiling. Perhaps a large spider. I froze, half expecting something far worse. The interior was cramped, with a few ragged curtains dividing the space into smaller sections. I ventured deeper, stepping into what looked like a shadowy sleeping area. A massive tangle of quilts lay on a wooden bunk, and the strangeness of it unsettled me. Each patch of fabric seemed layered with stains of mud and time, a testament to years alone in the swamp. Among the tattered quilts lay dried herb bundles, sage, lavender, something else far more pungent. From beneath the bunk, I heard the scrabbling of small claws, maybe a rat or possum. But it was the sense of an unseen occupant that unsettled me the most, as if the swamp witch's presence was crouched in a corner, just out of sight, waiting. I decided I had stayed long enough. Whatever answers I sought about the place clearly carried an air of danger. Before leaving, though, I noticed a battered leather-bound journal on a small side table. Could it hold secrets about the witch's curse? My pulse hammered as I opened it. The handwriting inside was spidery and erratic, the ink smeared in places. The early entries described daily chores, harvesting plants, and preparing salves for local townsfolk who visited the wise woman of the swamp. She had used herbal remedies to heal injuries, but there was also mention of darker practices. As the entries progressed, the writer complained of persecutors who labeled her a witch, who scorned her whenever misfortunes occurred among the townsfolk, blaming her for ill omens. The final entries were desperate, describing how, in a night lit by a blood-red moon, a mob came searching for her. They believed she had cursed a local farmer's child with a lethal malady. There were references to chanting, to the glow of torches reflecting on the water. Then, abruptly, the handwriting changed, heavier and more furious, describing a final act of defiance. She would bind her spirit to the cabin and the swamp, cursing any who dared to disturb her refuge. The final line read, "I will not rest. My power shall remain, to be heard on every moon." A chill crawled up my spine, as if I could sense her standing behind me, peering over my shoulder. When I stepped out of the cabin, my relief turned to dismay at the swiftly gathering black clouds overhead. The stagnant air pressed even heavier, and a sudden evening storm threatened. The wind picked up, sending the moss swaying in eerie unison. Over the stirring gusts, I heard it, a low, keening wail that rose and fell like the lament of a restless spirit. Despite my rational mind insisting it was only the wind, moaning through hollow branches, the sound felt too sorrowful, too deliberate. I hurried back around the side of the cabin, determined to reach my boat before the skies opened. Yet the shrieking cry echoed through the swamp again, and I nearly tripped over a submerged root in my flight. Darkness fell prematurely as the storm clouds choked out the final rays of light. Sheets of rain poured down, drenching me instantly. The water level began to rise around my knees, swirling in eddies that threatened to trip me on every step. My lantern flickered and died under the onslaught. I was left stumbling blind through the mire, guided only by the flashes of lightning that revealed the twisted cypress silhouettes. The wailing turned sharper, more piercing, like an anguished voice crying out. In a sudden flash, I saw her, a tall figure gliding across the water's surface, her hair draped in dripping tendrils, her face pale as bone. Her eyes found mine, and my heart thundered as if ready to tear from my chest. Then the light vanished. I scrambled forward, all sense of direction lost in the downpour. Each time lightning flared across the sky, I glimpsed her again, closer. My grandmother's admonition echoed. Don't let her catch your scent. I pressed on, ignoring the branches that lashed my arms, the mud that threatened to pull me under. The rumble of thunder drowned out my own ragged breathing, and in the next blaze of lightning, I saw the figure again, just a few feet away. Even in the strobing flashes, I could see her features twisted in wrath. She raised a bony hand, pointing accusingly, her mouth moving in silent curses. I turned away with a choked scream, desperate to find the path leading back to my boat. The storm abruptly subsided, and silence descended in its wake, a near absolute quiet broken only by the drip of water from leaves and the soft murmur of the swamp. In that hush, I heard faint footsteps behind me, squelching in the wet earth. Dreading what I might see, I glanced over my shoulder. At that moment, a swirl of mist uncoiled from the base of an ancient cypress, drifting around me in an almost sentient way, blocking my view through its swirling tendrils. I thought I saw her tattered shawl ripple, her white eyes narrowed in fury. My only hope was to keep moving. The boat might be my sanctuary, a means of escape from her watery domain. Miraculously, I spotted the stump where I had tied my boat, but the boat itself was gone. The rope lay severed and frayed, as though gnawed by something with razor teeth. My stomach clenched. I peered across the rippling water, searching for any sign of drifting wood. Nothing. A sense of overwhelming doom swallowed me. I was stranded, alone, with a spirit who had staked her claim here for centuries. Then, to my left, I saw a small glimmer, a lantern light, bobbing with each step, carried by someone or something on the far side of the channel. It seemed to beckon, swaying. Could it be another traveler? Perhaps help had arrived. I waded across the watery expanse, drawn by the promise of a human presence. The figure holding the lantern was cloaked in a muddy oilskin. As I approached, they turned abruptly, and I froze. Beneath the hood was a face carved with age and sorrow, eyes glossy with an inhuman sheen. It was only then I realized no living person should be able to stand upright in that water, which nearly reached my chest, yet the figure's feet plodded along the swamp bed with eerie ease. Its presence radiated cold. Its movements were mechanical, as though guided by a will not its own. I recalled the footprints in the cabin and wondered if this was another victim of the curse, an unwilling servant forced to wander the swamp at the witch's behest. When I attempted to speak, to beg for guidance, the figure lifted a thin hand and pressed a finger to its lips, a silent command to hush. Around us, the swamp seemed to hold its breath. The figure turned away from me, raising the lantern high as if to shine the light on a particular route through the knee-deep water. Not knowing what else to do, I followed. Slowly, step by step, I trailed the lantern's glow, which illuminated the path ahead, revealing bizarre patterns in the algae-coated water, as though something large slithered just beneath the surface. A wisp of an echo whispered from behind. A faint, "Come back to me," carried on the humid night air. I dared not look. I recognized the voice as the same that haunted my dreams. The figure in front quickened its pace, and I was forced to keep up. Under the wide net of starlight emerging from behind the receding storm clouds, we made our way through the labyrinth of cypress knees and drooping vines. The deeper we ventured, the more the swamp closed in, thickening with a tangle of ferns and rotting logs, like the swamp itself was tightening its hold upon us. At last, we reached a clearing around a moss-covered cypress so enormous it must have been centuries old. Its swollen trunk was draped with an array of soggy talismans, ribbon-bound twigs, skulls of small creatures, clusters of feathers. A pungent odor emanated from jars dangling by strings, no doubt filled with foul concoctions. The figure halted and turned to face me, lifting its hood. Even in the shadows I could see its face was gray, half-rotten, as though it had walked out of the grave. I gasped in horror, yet what terrified me more was the shimmer in its eyes, an anguish that seemed to beg for release. It pointed to the jars, then tapped its chest. I realized it wanted help, another victim ensnared by the witch's malice, perhaps used as a puppet. But what was I to do? In that moment, I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a cold that seeped from my skin to my bones. The figure reached out with trembling hands, offering me an iron key that dangled from a leather thong. Unsure of why or how, I took it. As soon as I did, a violent gust whipped through the clearing, rattling the talismans with a cacophonous clatter. A low hiss echoed across the water. The figure stumbled away, and I was left alone, key in hand, the lantern light bobbing off into the darkness. A voice, female and laced with centuries of anger, resonated around me. "No, that key is mine." I spun, searching for the source. She emerged from behind the colossal tree, the swamp witch herself, her hair trailing about her in a haze, eyes gleaming like two shards of moonlit ice. She extended a skeletal hand, and I felt a tightening in my chest, my muscles tensing as if seized by invisible fingers. Her gaze rested on the key. Though her mouth barely moved, I heard her words in my mind. "This land, this cabin, they are my bindings. So it shall remain." A cold sweat broke out on my brow. I recalled the witch's own journal, her vow never to abandon her hold on the swamp. The cabin was the anchor to her curse, yet something about that key felt crucial, a relic of her power. If it was hers, did it hold the secret to unbinding her? My arm, stiff and unresponsive, lifted in the direction of her outstretched hand, the key glinting. But something within me rebelled, refusing to let her snatch it away. I clenched my fist, resisting her pull. She hissed, stepping closer, and I could see the centuries-old bile in her features. Accusations of betrayal by the living, sorrow, bitterness. She spat out a curse in a language older than the local dialect. A wave of dizziness overwhelmed me, and I sank to my knees with a cry. Darkness flickered across my vision. In that haze, I was assaulted by the images from her life, the furious mob, The circle of torches, the jeers. I saw her cower in her cabin, curses dripping from her lips, the swirl of malignant magic drawn from the darkest corners of her knowledge. One final act to tether her soul to the swamp, damning all who intruded. Then, with a shock, I saw a sliver of regret, as if she realized her condemnation would trap her forever. She had built her own prison in that cabin, an eternal jailer over her domain. A faint memory of my grandmother's stories nudged its way into my consciousness. The rumor that the witch's spirit could be freed if someone broke the bond willingly. The key in my hand gleamed warmer now, as if it sensed the possibility of an ending. With fierce concentration, I summoned what remained of my strength, pressing my free hand against the spongy ground to stand upright. The witch screamed, clawing at the air as I lunged for a small recess in the giant cypress trunk where the jars and talismans hung. A hunch guided me, a desperate guess. Perhaps the key belonged in that hollow space, sealing away the dark hex, holding it in place. I felt heat flare, nearly burning my palm. The swamp witch's shriek rose to a sharp, frenzied pitch. But I did not let go. Hands gripped my shoulders from behind. The puppet figure had returned, and I feared it would stop me. Instead, it pushed me forward, aiding me. My hand forced the key deeper, jamming it into a notch in the cypress. Something wet and organic tore beneath my palm, and a gush of brackish water overflowed, as though a dozen jar spells had ruptured at once. The world spun. A final deafening cry shattered the air, and the spirit's presence vanished, leaving a vacuum behind. Then silence. An eerie stillness that left me gasping for breath. I looked around, heart pounding. There was no sign of the witch. The puppet figure lay collapsed at the base of the tree. The lantern sputtered out. Kneeling beside it, I realized the being's features looked younger, freed of rot, almost peaceful in death. I closed its eyes, gratitude coursing through me for its last act of help. The hush in the swamp felt different now, as if a malevolent tension had lifted. Exhaustion weighed on me like an anchor. I stumbled back through the water, searching again for my boat, uncertain if I was still cursed or if the land was finally liberated from her hold. After some time, I found my boat nestled among waterlogged reeds, half capsized, as though someone or some force had hidden it. With effort, I righted it and bailed out the swamp water. The journey home was slow, accompanied only by the subdued chorus of frogs and cricket. A waning moon glowed overhead, its reflection broken by the gentle ripples. Every so often I caught my breath, fearing a pale face might appear at the edge of my lantern's beam. But the spirit did not return. Instead, the swamp, though still eerie in its own right, felt strangely lighter. Back at the stilt house, I dried off by the smoldering remains of my hearth's fire. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by flickers of memories. The witch's visage, the key sinking into the cypress trunk, the puppet figure's sorrowful expression. Yet when the sun rose, bright and warm through the slats of my window, I awoke with an unaccustomed sense of peace. Venturing outside, I found the swamp remained the same in many ways. The same tangled vines, the same hush under the cypress canopy, but it felt less oppressive. The cabin, I guessed, still stood in the distance, half submerged, rotting on the swamp's outskirts. Perhaps it would remain that way, an empty husk without the witch's presence to animate it. As I washed my face in a basin of cool water, I finally allowed myself a small, relieved smile. The legend that bound that lonely structure had been cracked open, the dark power siphoned away. Yet, even as relief warmed my chest, I remembered how old curses have a tendency to linger, like silt along the bottom of a stagnant pool. There might always be a remnant of her that prowls the night, just as old shadows remain in the corners of an abandoned house. But the heart of her magic had been banished. And so I stayed in my grandmother's house for the weeks that followed, no longer afraid to watch the swamp at twilight. The breeze whispered its usual songs through the cypress. When a strong wind blew, I would catch the faintest echoes of a wail, though it was only the gust brushing against trees. At least, that is what I told myself. Locals sensed the change as well. Rumors of the cursed cabin grew quieter, and travelers no longer spoke of a woman's silhouette at its window. Life, in its rough swamp rhythm, flowed again without the heavy dread that once clung to every twig and droplet of moss. Yet I would be remiss to claim full victory. Even now, as the swamp breathes around me, I recall the witch's journal, her vow. I imagine the cabin's silhouette at dusk, no longer haunted by her vengeful shade, but still marked by the echo of her presence. If a traveler strays too near, maybe they will feel a soft hum, a memory of power that once summoned storms and shaped curses. The lines between the living and the dead can blur in this place. I can't deny the slightest unease in my pulse each time I drift near that side of the marsh. But I am not the same person who stumbled upon that cabin. I've borne witness to a final battle of curses, and I hold the memory of how quickly despair might unleash a torment that refuses to die. So now, at dusk, I lock the doors and shutter the windows, as my grandmother once told me. Perhaps everything is truly behind me, or perhaps some trace of the swamp witch's spirit still roams under moonlit skies, searching for a foothold in the mortal realm. Yet if she comes calling again, she will not find me unprepared, for I keep a lantern lit by the hearth and a battered cross of iron near the door, a reminder that sometimes it takes both courage and a bit of old magic to rest free of the darkest nightmares. And if those nightmares call my name again, I will answer and remind them which of us is truly cursed.